With us tonight on Wednesday night as we get ready to look at and to wrap up our study in the book of Ruth. It has been a certainly a very interesting study, and I hope that as you leave it, you don't just think about it being a story of a romance or of a woman who loved her mother-in-law or of a place where we get some really good verses we can use in weddings. All those things are true. But I really want us tonight to kind of wrap up and look at the impact that the story of Ruth and Boaz and Naomi and Obed and eventually Jesse and David certainly have on our lives and today as we live. Now, this is such an important chapter that I think we're going to look at it one verse at a time. And so I hope you'll get your Bible out to Ruth chapter 4 and we'll look at it and think about it. I will tell you I'm very happy to be back. I did had another test at the endoscopy center today that we get to go through as we get a little older, and I had got a good report out of it. Had a couple of polyps, but everything was good, and I appreciate your thoughts and your prayers for me in that regard. Starting in verse 1, now Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, a near kinsman of Boaz, of whom Boaz spoke, came by, to whom he said, "Friend, turn aside here." And he turned aside and sat down. Now Boaz went up to the gate. Now, some have thought that this meant that the city of Bethlehem was higher than the threshing floor. The threshing floor is at a lower altitude. But the problem with that would be if it would seem that a lot of scholars think that if it had been at a higher altitude than the city, it would have gotten a breeze and it would have been better for winnowing the grain, the barley and the wheat. Now, most of us know that you go up on top of Lookout, on top of Sand Mountain, there's usually a little more breeze blowing up there. Therefore, it appears that going up to the gate, my interpretation of it, and after looking at several commentators, my interpretation was that it refers to the authority, the high authority that the elders, the magistrates, and those that assembled in the gates, the city gates used. The city gate in those times was basically the equivalent of going to City Hall. It was a modern City Hall. If you want to take care of some business, you need to see someone in your city that's important, be it in Trenton or be it wherever you live, you go to City Hall. Well, the purpose of Boaz's appearance here becomes very, very clear early. He's going to fulfill the promise he made in chapter 3 to Ruth, and he's certainly going to do that, and he's going to do it very promptly and very efficiently. He says, "Friend, turn aside and sit down." Now, these are the words that Boaz greeted his near kinsman with. Now, probably, and I think it's very almost certain, Boaz addressed him by name, but the author of Ruth either didn't know his name or simply didn't wish to mention it, which is maybe the more likely. And Moffat rendered it in his translation, "Hey, you," or "Hi, you." Well, it might be something I might say to a close acquaintance. "Hey, buddy, come over and sit down." That's much more the scenario that we see happening there. Verse 2, and he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." And they sat down. Now, there's a couple of things interesting about that. One is the men that sat down there were men of importance and influence in the city, but they quickly and very promptly obeyed Boaz. And I think that indicates his power and his influence in the city, no doubt because perhaps of his age. Remember last week we said he may have been 80 years old. His wealth, he owned land and was a prominent landowner, and his reputation as being a good man. There may or may not be anything significant about the number 10. 10 does become in later times, it becomes the number that the quorum of resident Jews in a city that required for building a synagogue. But it also might have just been something as simple as that was a unusual number to witness any important transaction, or it may have just been that that was the 10 men that were there. Verse 3, and he said to the near kinsman, Naomi that has come out of the country of Moab is selling the parcel of land which was our brother Elimelech's. Naomi is selling the land. This is the first indication that Naomi had any land. And it also indicates pretty clearly to me that there had been more extensive contact between Boaz, Naomi, and Ruth than certainly has been recorded in the first 3 chapters. We really aren't told how Naomi came to own this land, but in probability, a couple of things existed. Maybe she was acting as an agent, if you will, for her deceased sons, in whose land the title might well have been vested. Matthew Henry, in his commentary, said that perhaps Elimelech had been forced to mortgage the property during the famine, and that drove the family to Moab. But in any event, remember this. If you remember the year of Jubilee that came about as a part of the law of Moses, every 50 years, whatever land you bought reverted back to the owner. So what Naomi really was selling amounted to the use of the land for an unspecified number of years. Now he says in that verse also, he says, our brother Elimelech. Now the term brother there is used in the same sense as a brother Israelite, which is used frequently in the Old Testament to refer to other Israelites. And it could have been the reference to a kinsman, to something like that. Verse 4, and I thought to disclose it unto thee, saying, buy it before them that sit here, and before the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not redeem it, then tell me, for there is none to redeem it except you, and I'm after you. And he said, I will redeem it. Where it says in the first part of the verse, it says, and therefore I thought to disclose it, saying, that's in the ancient Hebrew writing, a primitive expression that denotes his internal thoughts and thought process, his internal resolution. For example, something like we might say, I said to myself, it's what I need to do. Before the elders of my people. Now, others besides the official 10 witnesses apparently also had assembled, perhaps out of curiosity, and no doubt to learn the news of what Boaz might be doing. What's this very important citizen? This important man is here. There must be something important going on. And so Boaz lays out the situation to this near kinsman. And the near kinsman says, well, of course I'll redeem it. I'll take that land. Now, this would have been a windfall for that man. Naomi was a poor widow, and she wasn't in a position to command a very high price for the land. And besides, the year of Jubilee is coming, which might not have been very far away, and it would revert theoretically to Elimelech's heirs then. And since he had no heirs, it would have remained in this near kinsman's position. So this was a really good deal. But as we see this story unfold, we see how that Boaz was handling the situation with just masterful skill and discernment. Now, he had no doubt had anticipated this answer. A friend of mine who's a lawyer told me a long time ago, he said, a lawyer never asks a question unless you know the answer. Well, Boaz was not being a lawyer here, but as a negotiator, he asked a question that he already knew the answer to. Now look at verse 5, though. Then said Boaz, when you buy the field of the land from the hand of Naomi, you also must acquire with it Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of the dead, to raise up the name of the dead in his inheritance. Now, Ruth the Moabitess, he says there. This is the 4th or 5th time that phrase has been used. And this time, these words, they scare the near kinsman right out of his shoes. We'll get to that in just a minute, but they're going to scare him right out of the transaction. There was traditionally thought, and so many of the ancient writers write that in Bethlehem, the belief was that Chilion, and one last salute to my buddy Chili Dog, Chilion and Malon had died for marrying Moabitish women. And when the near kinsman found out that when he got that land, it also meant marrying a Moabite woman, he quickly and dramatically withdrew his offer. Now, under the situation, as was explained by Boaz, he was going to, number one, acquire another family. Number two, he would lose the money paid for the land, for that would belong to Ruth, her son, if they married. It would no longer be a part of his inheritance. Additionally, he realized, I'm going to be burdened with the support of another family. When you see all that presented to him, and Boaz wasn't deceptive, Boaz just played the trump card at precisely the right moment. And when he did, it's not hard to understand why that near relative made such a hasty exit from the transaction. So now Boaz is free to marry Ruth, which undoubtedly he wanted to do and was intending to do from the very first. Verse 6, the near kinsman said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I jeopardize mine own inheritance. Take thou my right of redemption on thee, for I cannot redeem it. These words simply meant, I cannot afford it. Now, there are two reasons that would have entered into this refusal. Number one, the increased financial burden inherent in rearing another family. You take on more people, you've got more mouths to feed, it takes more money. And then secondly, remember going back to that stigma and the thought of what happened to Mahlon and Chilion because of marrying the Moabites, the stigma that popular prejudice attached to the marriage to a foreigner, especially to a Moabite woman. So there it was. This verse also reveals the moment of truth for the entire transaction. This near kinsman refused twice to redeem it, and he also declared that he waived his right to do so, and then he requested, Boaz, you take the right for yourself. Well, of course, Boaz promptly did that. He proclaimed that he was going to redeem the land and his intention of marrying Ruth to raise up a son to carry forward the name and the family of Elimelech. Now, verse 7, this gets to be an interesting, a very important verse in the book. Now, this was the custom in the former days in Israel concerning redeeming and concerning exchanging to confirm all things. A man drew off his shoe or his sandal and gave it to his neighbor. This was the manner of attestation in Israel. As I mentioned, in some ways, this is probably the most important verse in the book because the liberal critics of the book of Ruth, of the Bible, have made this the basis of the late dating of the book, the writing of the book in post-exilic times, after the exile into Babylon. Now, there are many reasons why this action on the part of these Bible enemies is totally inaccurate and totally unjustified, but it's also extremely ridiculous and contrary to overwhelming evidence elsewhere in the book of Israel. He said in the earlier days, or in the former time, the former days in Israel. Well, in the first place, this does not mean 500 years ago necessarily. These words were just as appropriate when Samuel, as I believe and many scholars believe, wrote Ruth as they could have been at any other time. The date of Samuel's authorship was at a time probably after he had anointed David to be the king of Israel instead of Saul, about 1000 BC. And the custom referred to, according to Dr. F. LaGard Smith, was between the time of the judges of Abdon and Samson.
both of who were about a century or more before Ruth was written. In former times, folks, can refer to 1 century ago as well as it can 5 centuries ago. An example, if I say my grandfather was a brave soldier and was involved in World War One, it was 100 years ago. In the former days, earlier days in the history of our country. If I go back and said to you that in the early days, I've been unable to find any of my relatives in Jamestown, that was 500 years ago. But both of those statements are true, and neither one has to be taken out of context or has to have a lot of context with it. It just indicates former days means it was before my time. Now, this was the custom, it says next. This is not a reference to the Levirate marriage or to the marriage that was the custom under the law of Moses, under the Levi's law. It wasn't a custom because the law of Moses wasn't a custom, but it was a divine law. Even though the drawing off of a shoe or a sandal was not connected with the Levirate law or the law of Moses, because in that law, the disgrace of the brother who refused to marry his brother's widow was humiliated by the widow publicly spitting in his face. But nothing like that is found here as we read in verse 7. Here, the drawing off of the shoe was not a disgrace, it wasn't a humiliation, but it was a confirmation of the transfer, of the surrender of a right, particularly in this case, the right of redemption. By the way, it appears to us that almost everyone in this seems to think this was just an evidence of transfer. Now, at this time, it doesn't appear that written records were handled in transferring the property. It was in front of witnesses. The transfer was made, and by this time was made evidence by the taking off of a shoe. What that means beyond that, I don't really know. There's a number of things of what it means. I won't walk on this ground. It won't be my ground. But regardless, it's evidence that it becomes an evidence of the transaction. Now, we do know by Jeremiah chapter 32, there were written records, and in all probability, probably much earlier than that. Now, writing was known at the time of Moses. Remember the young man that Gideon met on the highway earlier in this book of Judges we just studied last semester, recorded the names of the magistrates of Succoth. He gave them all the written down names. Of course, they went in. Those are the ones that were punished by Gideon. Now, verse 8 continues about the shoe. So the near kinsman said unto Boaz, buy it for yourself. And he drew off his shoe. So here's the picture. He draws off his shoe. He hands his sandal to Boaz, symbolizing the transfer of his right of redemption. Of course, the ceremony ended. Several people asked me about it earlier when we were talking about it. We were laughing about it. Boaz returned the shoe to his near kinsman. Almost every commentator said that, and I think that's probably pretty average. You wouldn't send a guy hopping home or walking home barefooted. You'd give him his shoe back. It just had symbolized in front of the witnesses, this is a transaction that is permanent. It's done. Verse 9. Then Boaz said to the elders and to all the people, you are witnesses this day that I bought all that was Elimelech's, all that was Chilion's and Mahlon's, of the hand of Naomi. Now, this declaration, this statement by Boaz before the court of the elders, the fathers of the city, in the gate of the city, constituted his acceptance and their witnessing of the legal transfer to Boaz of the right of redemption, just as it had been renounced by the near kinsman. Now, this was not all of the legal procedure, for it also is included as we drop down to verse number 10. If you look ahead to verse 10. Moreover, This is Boaz continuing to talk. Moreover, Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of Mahlon, I have taken, some versions say purchased, some say bought, to be my wife, to raise up the name of the dead upon his inheritance, that the name of the dead be not cut off from among his brethren. Now, a number of the versions say Ruth the Moabitess, whom I have bought or who I have purchased. Well, this statement stands in respect to the legal proceedings before the village elders and before the village court, and it does not mean in any sense that Boaz, in the ordinary sense certainly, was purchasing Ruth. What is meant is that Boaz was buying the land from Naomi, and that the land purchase also included the right and the obligation for him to marry Ruth. The proceedings here only gave only gave Boaz the right to marry Ruth. The actual marriage is going to take place. We're going to see the recording of it about 3 verses later. Now, Leon Morris in his commentary talked about just this unselfish and magnanimous act, even though he loved her, on the part of Boaz. But he said this tells us something about God, and I wanted to read this to you at this time. Leon Morris said this: God must feel at least as compassionate toward all the Ruths of Moab and Babylon and of every other land as his creature Boaz felt toward Ruth. In other words, God feels toward us and loves us more than, but in the same way that Boaz loved Ruth. And secondly, God must actually be a God of redemption, with the desire and the power to redeem all the outcast into fellowship with him. As you read and as we look down and think about this story, Ruth was an outcast. She was a foreigner. She was a widow. She was a woman who most of the people in Bethlehem thought that her husband had died because he married her. So she was certainly someone that needed redemption, and Boaz made that redemption. Today, of course, the lesson is obviously we all need redemption. We're in far worse shape without God than Ruth was without Boaz. But Boaz redeemed and brought back Ruth. God redeems and brings back us into fellowship with him. Beautiful analogy there, and I think that certainly is fitting to this story here. Verse 11, all the people that were in the gate and the elders said, we are witnesses. Jehovah, make the woman that is to come into your house like Rachel and Leah, which did indeed build the house of Israel, and thou be wealthy and worthy in Ephrathah, and be famous in Bethlehem. The Lord make the woman like Rachel and Leah. Now, the recorded text doesn't make it clear, but it seems this extensive blessing, this more extended blessing, was probably offered by the elders, or one of them, whereas the witnesses there had just been around and shouted at the appropriate time, we're witnesses. All in favor say aye. Aye. All in favor say so by raise your hand. That's what we are witnesses meant there. We're witnesses. We've seen this. But then the elders went ahead and said, look, we want to put a blessing on you. Be famous in Bethlehem. Now, the goodwill of all the elders and the leadership in the city appears in these expressions of prayerful good wishes. The people are apparently hoping that Ruth would bear many children to Boaz, as indicated by Rachel and Leah. There's put together quite a family those two did right there. And then verse 12 is very interesting. Verse 12 is an interesting verse when you read it and think about it for a moment. And let your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bare unto Judah, of the seed which the Lord shall give thee of this young woman. Now, it might first appear if you're a Bible student and you know who Perez of Tamar, because of Judah's shameful action, that might appear to be an inappropriate place to mention, an inappropriate thing to mention. But the significance of it lies in the fact of Tamar having been a foreigner. She was a Canaanite, a non-Israelite, just like Ruth. Interestingly, if you get to Matthew chapter 1, verses 3 and 5, guess what two of the women that are mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus Christ? Tamar and Ruth. Thus, this blessing of these elders that day was realized in the fullness of time, fully realized in the fullness of time. I think that's interesting. I kind of like that. Verse 13. Now the wedding's taking place, so to speak. Officially they're married now. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bare a son. So Boaz took Ruth. This is a reference, just these four words here, four little words, they make reference to the marriage ceremony itself. Then he goes ahead, she became his wife, he went into her, the fact the marriage was consummated, and the blessing of God on their union by the birth of a son. Now, this verse really is sort of, if you're watching a play on stage, over here on this side of the stage, right now you've got you got Ruth and Boaz, and they're the main players. But from this verse on, they kind of wander off the stage. And all of a sudden, right here in the middle of the stage, there's going to be a little baby. And that little baby's family that's going to be born of him. It's going to be very prominent in history from then on. So let's drop down to verse 14. So the women said unto Naomi, Blessed be Jehovah, who has not left thee this day without a near kinsman, and let his name be famous in Israel. The women said to Naomi. Now, this reminds us, again, now in the center of the stage right now, there's Naomi. This narrative, this book, this story is basically the story of Naomi. It is altogether fitting, therefore, that at the end, attention is going to turn to her, and we're going to see a 180 switch, a radical reverse of her fortune. We remember how that in the beginning, she had good things going on. Good things were going on for her. And then, remember, the famine came. She and her husbands, they left, went to Moab, married. Things seemed to be going good for them. And then all of a sudden, it seems like the bottom falls out. And she comes back, and remember, she said, Don't even call me Naomi. Don't call me by that pleasant name. Call me by a much, much sadder name. Call me bitter. Don't call me Naomi, because I'm not pleasant. It's bitter right now. But guess what? He also begins to, you see the whole thing go full circle. At the end, it's even better than she could have imagined. These women said, Look, the Lord didn't leave you without a near kinsman. And then listen to verse 15. And he shall be unto thee a restorer of life, and a nurturer in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves thee, is better than 7 sons. Who is better than 7 sons has borne him. A nourisher of you in your old age. Until the birth of this grandson, until Boaz, the marriage of Ruth, the prospect for old age for Naomi looked, in that time, in that environment, it looked pretty bleak and pretty threatening. But now she's got a grandson, and that's changed everything dramatically. The prospect of an heir of both Mahlon and Boaz. The child Obed is going to be a source of strength and support for Ruth and for his grandmother Naomi. These lines kind of give us a little hint there that in a sense that the child belongs to Naomi. That we're not going to get into that. She didn't adopt him, and she didn't. We're going to talk about that in verse 16. But this baby boy had a special place in the life of Naomi. Certainly, as grandparents, we can understand that, but this one's even especially close. For your daughter-in-law loves you. Of course, the key factor in all of the tremendous blessing and all of the honor that came to Naomi with the birth of this child was all centered around the unfeigned, the unfailing love of Ruth for her mother-in-law, which there had already been so many conclusive and undeniable proofs. Every time there was a chance to show it, guess what? Ruth showed it. And then the last phrase, who's better to you than 7 sons. Now, I've got an older friend, you know who you are if you're watching tonight, who always said to me, oh, you don't have any sons. You must be terrible. You always wanted sons. Well, I got to tell him, Donnie boy, daughters are pretty good too. But in ancient times, the ancients certainly preferred having sons rather than daughters. That was going to be someone that could work the land, could inherit the land, could do all those things in a traditional way. But in that context, in the context of that world, that ancient world in the ancient Near East, in the view of sons versus daughters, the statement that they made to this woman Ruth, or to this woman Naomi, that having Ruth was better than having 7 sons, was the ultimate and the supreme compliment and tribute. There is nothing better that could have been said to an ancient in those times, and the children of Israel in those times, at the time of the judges, than to say, hey, what a great woman she was. She brought 7 sons to her family. Well, here, these women recognize, and again, you want to see what an impression that Ruth had made on Bethlehem. They recognized that, and they said to Naomi, they said, that daughter-in-law you've got, she's a good one. We'd say she's a good one. She's better than 7 sons. Pretty high compliment, pretty strong tribute to Ruth right there. Verse 16, now we're getting toward the end of the story. And Naomi took the child and laid it on her breast, and she became nurse to it. Now, this doesn't mean that Naomi adopted the child or there was anything unusual about it. It doesn't mean even that she was what would be called a wet nurse. She wasn't necessarily even nursing the child. What comes into view here is the honored place that Boaz gave her, that wealthy and powerful man gave her in his household. Now, the tradition says, the Bible doesn't say this, but if I was writing First Donald, I'd put it in First Donald probably, or Second or Third Donald, that Boaz was a widower and childless, and nothing in the Bible contradicts that, but it's not revealed in the Bible, but that's what tradition says. And so it would have been the most natural thing in the world for Boaz to have moved Naomi into the big house. He moved her uptown. She moved uptown, moving on up, and she became the full-time nurse, caretaker, babysitter for this new infant, taking care of her. Beautiful part of the story. This story, just as it unfolds, you keep seeing layer after layer of beautiful and loving things that are revealed. Verse 17, and the neighbors gave it a name, saying, there's a son born to Naomi. And they called his name Obed. He is the father of Jesse and the father of David. Now, a son born to Naomi. That's not a typographical error. That's not a misstatement. In Hebrew writing, ancient Hebrew writing, the terms son and grandson are sometimes used interchangeably, as they are here. And they called his name Obed, comes up next. And the neighbors gave it a name, gave him a name, saying, he's called his name Obed. Now, this doesn't mean that Ruth and Boaz and Naomi had no part in the choice of the name, but that they consented in going along with the suggestion of the neighboring women. The context of the chapter, I think, suggests that perhaps they went along with this because tradition says that the name service or worshiper is what the name Obed means. And certainly, Obed is apparently going to carry forth a great part of caring for Naomi in her old age. And that's what we're going to see, is what's going to happen as we see that here. Now, he's the father of Jesse. Obed is the father of David. Now, these words show the object the author had in writing down these words and in composing the book itself. You're going to see as the genealogy is included at the end of the book. But see, these verses also, the Holy Spirit never reveals things that are going to be contradictory. But these things are undeniable proof of the date of the writing of the book of Ruth. Notice that David is not called King David here. Why was he not called King David? Because he was not yet the king of Israel when this book was written by Samuel at a time. I think, and it makes logical sense, the more I study it, the more I read it, the more I see it, that the book was written by Samuel after God had commanded him to anoint David as the king who would take the place of Saul, but before he became king. Now, that makes good sense to me. Maybe you don't. You keep studying. Maybe you can find something else. But a lot of the other arguments I looked at just look ridiculous compared to that. So you've gotten verse 17. We're introduced to the genealogy, if you will. We'll get the short version here. Obed, the father of Jesse, the father of David. Moving forward. Now we're going to move backwards. And here's how it happens. We start moving backwards in verse 18. Remember, Perez was mentioned earlier. Perez, some prefer. Perez, now these are the generations of Perez. Perez begat Hezron, and Hezron begat Ram. Ram begat Amminadab, and Amminadab begat Nahshon, and Nahshon begat Salmon, and Salmon begat Boaz, and Boaz begat Obed, and Obed begat Jesse, and Jesse begat David. Now, I think without doubt, the end of the genealogy with the name of David proves that Ruth was written during the life of David. And it had to be written at a time before he became king. If he had been king, the text would have referred to him as King David. Now, I don't know why these other scholars, these other commentators that I read and looked through, why they are so anxious to establish the fairy tale of a post-exilic date for this book. But they cannot help but know this is true because these are educated men. Now, what is their defense against the facts? Well, some simply say that Ruth 4, 17 to 22 is just an added interpretation, a commentary added later. Well, as we wrap up the book of Ruth, the idea that Ruth was written in post-exilic times is unacceptable in my opinion, in my beliefs, for the simple reason that at such a period in Israel's history, there would not have been any interest in the production of such a book. Why would you write a book like that 400 years later? Or what would be the motive for terminating the genealogy with David? Why wouldn't you go ahead and name Solomon and Rehoboam, and go all the way down through. Keel, in his commentary, wrote this: This genealogy makes it certain that the purpose of the book was to disclose the pious ancestry of the wonderful person who later, meaning after Ruth was written, would become the king of Israel. I think there's no doubt this book was written during the life of Samuel. We started off with that, and I'll kind of wrap it up with that. As you study the book of Ruth, I certainly want you to remember her there, Naomi going down to Moab, coming back after her husband and her sons have died with Ruth, her only, all that beautiful story of that in chapter 1. The going out and the gleaning in chapter 2 and 3, and the getting to know of Boaz, the marriage after the redemption done in Moab, in Bethlehem, with the near kinsman at the city gate in chapter 3 and 4, and then the beautiful marriage that's revealed in chapter 4, and the closing out the genealogy of Obed, Jesse, David, and eventually Jesus Christ. All of that comes right through the book of Ruth. So the book of Ruth, and an outstanding, to me, just a wonderful, wonderful chapter in the history of Israel. We're going to continue our study in the Old Testament next week. We're going to start off, and I want you to read 1 Samuel chapter 1. We talked about a little baby that was born at the end of the book of Ruth. We start off over here in Samuel. Guess what we're going to look at again? Look at another woman wanting a baby and how important that baby's going to be. We're going to look at Hannah next week, and Hannah, a righteous woman, and how that Hannah's going to have a son, and how that son is going to play a huge part. Not only he will play a part in the life of David, who we just closed the book of Ruth with, he's also going to play a huge part in the history of Israel, certainly in the first two kings of Israel under Saul and Samuel. Saul and David. Samuel's going to be a key player. Thanks for being here. Give you a couple of quick updates. Randall Harris is in the rehabilitation center at Encompass across from Park Ridge. Talk to Starla if you want to about how you can work out a visit if you would like to make a visit. Also, his address is up on the Trenton Church Facebook page. You can get it there, or private message me and I'll send it to you privately. If you can't find that, don't know how to do that, we'll get that for you. Snooky Martha Pitts is in the rehab hospital over in Fort Oglethorpe. It is Park Side. It is in front, more or less in front of the old Hutchinson Tri-County Hospital. And she's report I got was she's get off to a good start there and doing well there. Want to remember Jewel Whitley. Jewel is in Fort Payne. She's in the senior care unit down there. Her daughter said she does not expect her probably to ever be able to live on her own again. She'll be living with her when she gets out of there. She cannot have visitors. She cannot have phone calls, but she can get cards. So I put up the address. Look it up on the Facebook page, church Facebook page, and find it. I think I forwarded them all to my Facebook page, which some of you may be watching on tonight. But if you can't find them, send me a private message or text me, and I'll send them to you then, and we'll get back with you. But send out cards. Be an encourager to other people as you have chance and have opportunity. An update on our building. We got the word from the abatement company, really through Service Master, through our adjuster with Alpha, that they are coming. It has been approved. The insurance company is going to pay for the abatement. By the way, it's over $17,000. So we're thankful for that. But the abatement company, like everybody today, it seems like is backed up. They will not be able to start until August the 4th. They hope to be finished by August the 6th in those 3 days. Then it'll have to be tested. And when they finish, then Service Master comes back in when they finish and get it dry and get everything where it can be rebuilt and redone, a contractor will come back in and we'll get that. We've made arrangements looking for contractors, looking for things like that already, making plans to get that done. You may wonder where we're going to worship, where we're going to meet until then. Well, we're going to meet. I talked with Terry Powell, our city councilman who's over Parks and Recreation. That includes the Civic Center, and he has allowed us to use it through the 8th of the month. Now, we'll need to get there about 9 o'clock every morning and set the chairs up, break them down, put them up, and make sure the floor's kept clean. If you can, refrain from bringing food and drink in there. If you have to bring in something, bring in water. Certainly, a bottle for a child would not be inappropriate. But if you need to do those things, let's do that. But if you can avoid bringing in stuff and spilling stuff, that just means we'd have to mop the floor. We don't want to. We prefer not to do that. So if you can help us in that regard, we'll do that. I do already have set out some of the little baggies to take on Sunday, so hopefully we'll have them there. But we will be meeting there through the 8th. Now, if we need to meet on the 15th, the elders are going to meet tomorrow night, and we're going to hopefully try to work out something for the 15th. But we're going to stay at the Civic Center from now until the 15th, the 8th of the month. So you can plan on being there. Again, our Bible classes worked out good last week. Parents of teenagers, pay attention to watch Matt's stream. He's got some information. He'll be getting some information to you about that, about where they're going to meet and how they're going to do that on Sunday morning as well. Ken will be teaching this class in the auditorium or in the Civic Center. And our ladies I went out and watched some of what they did last week. It was amazing. And those kids just loved it. They've already figured out and looked at different places they can go if they do it. We also, for those of you that have small children or babies, we have set up the kitchen, which is if you walk out of the lobby like you're going to the bathrooms, the first door on your right. We would ask you, if you're not a mother with a child, please stay out of the kitchen, but we've got it set up with some chairs and things there so they can use that and have some privacy and quiet in there if they need to go into there. So we've got that set up for them as well. That's about what I can tell you right now. I know it's been a long time since first week in June, but hey, I'm thankful for it, and I'm thankful we're making the progress. Thankful that we got insurance, aren't you? Aren't you glad to have insurance? It's going to make it. But by the way, I did go to the endoscopy center today. I'll get it right in a minute. I had nothing wrong. Both my parents had colon cancer, and I have colonoscopies to check on that from time to time. And my doctor said everything looked good, and only 2 little small polyps they took out. So I felt very good. That was earlier today, and I'm thankful for that. Appreciate your prayers, your thoughts for that. Hope you'll have a good night. Lord willing, I'll be with you in the morning at 7 a.m. I'll be back live in the morning at 7 a.m. Hope to see you then. Hope you'll have a good day and a blessed day. God bless you and keep you safe, and I'll see you soon.